Next, we have Gilad. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that.
No, you're doing
Gilad,
well.
Okay. Gilad presenting a talk called Enhancing Liveness with Exemplars in the Newspeak IDE.
Yeah, okay, let me just find the window. You all can see this?
Yep, it's coming through.
Okay, so as it says, this is a work about improving the liveness of the Newspeak IDE, which is a web-based IDE that I work on in my spare time for Newspeak, which is also a language that I work on in my spare time. It's kind of Smalltalk-like. And so the basic idea is something that should be familiar to everybody who sort of frequents this workshop, which is we don't want dead code. We don't want to be in a situation where we're looking at code, editing, doing anything with code, where we have to simulate it in our heads. We want to be able to go and evaluate code and see what it does. Let the computer simulate it. It's much better at that. So that's not a new idea. The oldest reference I've actually found is Jonathan Edwards' work from 2004 that I was sort of blissfully unaware of for a long time. I myself presented at this same workshop 8 years ago, an early prototype of something like this in the old Newspeak environment that was running on top of Squeak. And there's lots of others. I've got a slide on related work we'll eventually get to. But it's still an underexplored idea. It's still, there's lots of variations, lots of ways to do things, and we really have to nail this down. So you can view this as yet another exploration. And the context this time is this web-based IDE for Newspeak that I'm working on, which is a new generation of the previous system. And I think I'm finally getting pretty close to something that I can actually make the entire system work around. The experiments done in 2012-13 never really panned out. So what this work is not about is about getting exemplar data. There's lots of papers that are, doing traces, doing various clever things, because there is this problem. How do you get the data that if you're going to fill out all the values for all the variables so that you actually have something that you can evaluate, obtaining that data is an interesting problem. And I concluded based on my previous experiments that was actually hard and not really necessary. You can do that. It's sort of orthogonal in various ways, but I decided to take the simplest approach, which is to simply say that the programmer is going to give me textual expressions that will instantiate a given object or call a given method, and they'll put them into the code. They'll live with the code as metadata. And so metadata in Newspeak are comments and vice versa. That is, comments are not just stuff that the lexer jumps through and is ignored. The language spec tells you how comments are associated with specific constructs so that they can be tied to specific ASTs. There's a reflective API that can recover these comments for you at runtime, and that reflective API is available during development. It might not be available at runtime because it's a OCAP language which can attenuate reflection, but for the IDE, that's not a problem. What these comments look like, here's one. They look like Pascal comments for anyone who's old enough to remember. The comments we are interested in are tagged comments, or metadata comments, as I call them. This is a tag, and basically, the stuff there is used to index the metadata comments, so you can ask the reflective API to look up comments with a certain tag. It doesn't understand what the tags mean, but it understands the concept of a tag. And then any application that is interested in a particular tag can look up those comments and then get the actual metadata, which would be the actual contents of the comment, and do with it as it will. Just a refresher, I'm sort of hoping that almost everyone here kind of is comfortable with Smalltalk syntax, because if you're into live programming, you really should be familiar with Smalltalk. But just in case, no dots. O.x is OX. In Newspeak methods and properties are the same things, and there's no argument list unless there actually are arguments, in which case it uses a keyword syntax. Variables are declared between vertical bars, and returning an expression uses a circumflex. That's pretty much what you need to know to read any code. Here's the IDE running in the browser, and what we're going to do, I'm going to deliberately load in this thing because it's important for this approach that we can get code from anywhere, that it doesn't have to live in this rich environment in the first place. It doesn't have to have an application to trace through. It doesn't have to do anything. You can just grab stuff from source control or wherever and immediately work with it, or a library that doesn't even have an application associated with it. Once we've loaded bank account, we can look at bank account. So bank account is a class, but you'll notice here that we have an instance. And the instance, we can see there's an instance variable or slot, has a value 100. This is the balance slot that's shown here. So this is basically an object inspector, except that it shows you the class in the context of the object. And it has the usual inspector stuff. So there's an evaluator here where you can say something like this, and if you evaluate that, you get the value, right? So that's the usual object inspector stuff. The question is, first, how did we get to know that we're going to have this particular instance with a balance of 100? So we can look here. This is a factory method. This is what creates instances. You can think of it as sort of like a constructor. And so we see here's one of those tagged comments. And exemplar is the tag that makes that the IDE is interested in, that tells it that this is exemplar data. Anything that starts with exemplar, there can be multiples. And then there's an expression which says, well, I forgot the class bank account. I send it the message balance : and here's the argument I'm selling. And the IDE can then take that, evaluate that, and produce this object to inspect. So that's sort of it's a very cheap solution, but it's fine. We'll discuss the pros and cons as we go along. So a similar thing works for methods. So here, the deposit method has, again, an exemplar tag and a send of deposit 100. There's sort of interesting details about scoping here that if you ask me later, because I don't want to take up too much time about getting into the nitty-gritty of this, you can now evaluate things like amount and see that it is indeed 100 because it came as the argument from here. You can evaluate expressions within the context of the object. And what did I do here? Yes, I didn't select the right thing. Right, my selection ended here. So if we do this properly, we'll get the result that you expect. There's a debug button. If we press that, we get into a debugger that similarly has a fairly usual debugger interface. And one thing the debugger has, because it has more real estate, it has a separate window where we can evaluate extra stuff, right? Like this stuff, right? So, and we get a result. Now, if we go back, sometimes that's useful. And so we do have the option here of adding an evaluator. So if we really want to dedicate the space, we get an evaluator. And here again, I can say things like, and that's kind of how we can get sort of the effect of an object inspector on this particular method in context with its variables. Now there's a question, what happens when you have multiple control paths and different arguments are useful? So we can look here at withdraw, for example, and there's a whole bunch of exemplars with different values. And instead of a debug button, we now have a menu, which lets us choose, one of these guys. And indeed, here we got one with an amount of 10 because that's the option we chose. Other than that, this mostly works the same way as the rest. All of this, by the way, is very early work. And so there are, caveats, bugs galore, etc. But it does does work. I have to move this so I can actually see what I'm doing here. So that's kind of other things I want to emphasize. This has to work for everything, right, in the IDE. So for example, if I look for senders of deposit, well, there aren't any, but I do get an implementer of deposit, which is the one we just saw, but I'm no longer in the context of the object inspector in terms of the visuals, in terms of the presentation, but I still need to have all this kind of stuff to work, right? So I still should be able to have all these facilities of debugging and so forth. And this has to happen in every view that we have in the IDE. Moving on, there's certainly issues that you can raise, and there are a lot of good comments in the reviews for the workshop about problems you might have. And I'm not going to go through all of them. Ask me questions later if you're really interested. We have answers for most of these things to one degree or another, but there are certainly concerns with this approach. But I think we have pretty good answers for them. And yeah, if we have time afterwards in the questions, maybe we can discuss them. There's a whole bunch of related work which goes back, of course, to, I find it really interesting from the historical perspective that the very earliest environments like REPLs for BASIC and APL workspaces back in the 60s and 70s actually integrated editing and evaluation. And later REPLs tend to not do that and become actually less useful for development. On the other hand, there's the whole, of course, Smalltalk and self and Lisp machine tradition of really rich image-based environments where you can do some of this stuff. But even there's a problem that code is often dead, right? When you're editing, the editor code is not fully alive. You can't necessarily evaluate everything because you don't have the data. Then there's a whole bunch of more recent stuff that people in this community have done. What do I want to tell you? Beyond that, you can look at this at the Newspeak website. There you can actually run it in a demo in your browser. You can also download an Electron thing so that you can, an app that you can run locally. None of this is for primetime use yet. We're getting better, but if you really play with this, you will quickly find that I've been working on it in my spare time and there are lots of bugs. It is, however, we're getting to a point where this is increasingly the main paradigm for interacting with the IDE. That is no longer looking at dead classes, but looking at them through the object inspector. And the overall idea is in a case like Newspeak, where everything's a message send and therefore everything is an object, once you have the tooling, then everything's an object inspector. That's kind of the message here. The object inspectors can be customized, but really you should always be looking at objects, not at code as such as text. So that's what I wanted to say in my 12 minutes. And if anyone has questions, I might be able to show you answers. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think I saw Jonathan's hand first. Jonathan, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Am I on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very nice, Gilad. I really like it really feels usable almost, right? Like it's something that you could imagine actually working, unlike so much of my work in particular.
Oh, I don't know, but we're getting there.
Yeah, it's nice. So, but my question is, a hard problem is side effects, right? So when code, the purpose of the code is to make side effects on other objects. How do you set up the exemplar of that and then go clicking around and seeing what side effects are happening?
Right. So that is one of the hard problems. And it is certainly true that all of this would, to some extent, this is one of, I've said many times that actually the killer app for functional programming is Liveness, because a lot of these problems get easier. So this is especially acute in a system like this, right, where some of the things you're inspecting is the code of the IDE itself, which is all visible in the IDE and live. And so the shoot yourself in the foot problem is if you side effect or do something to it, and break things while you're doing it. And so you generally, when you set up exemplars for these, you just have to be careful to set them up as exemplars for objects that aren't in live use. And if you are side effecting things and you do things with it, then you'll navigate the way the IDE navigates in general, right? You can go to the results, you can look up things, but we're not. And you can customize the object inspectors. Like if it's an object which you could show that, right? If you wanted to, because there is a mechanism here for having custom views and things, which is kind of a poor cousin of the kind of stuff that Glamorous Toolkit does. It's not as polished, but the same kind of idea. So you'd have to worry about that in each case individually. I don't think I have a magic answer for it.
Yeah, the classic hard example is, a sort algorithm where you're, munging up an array and you want to inspect the various steps of that along the way. And how do you visualize that?
Right. So this is sort of this is visualizing in time as opposed to visualizing the structure. And the problem with all the algorithm animation stuff is it's a lot of custom work. It's great for education when you invest that, but if you're building a data structure, kind of customizing your presentation for it is a bit much. And because if you do customize, you can create an object inspector for sorting, right? A custom view for arrays that might do that, but it's more work than it's worth, right? So yeah, that's not the time dynamics. That's not something that I've focused on.
Thanks.
I see Jeffrey's hand, but Brian, did you raise your hand earlier? I also thought I saw one more hand. Is that no more? Okay. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks for the talk. I was curious about your experience with the specifying examples inline just in text. I love how simple that is, and I'm curious. What has it been like using that, especially on more complicated examples where it might be not just a single number, but a more complicated example.
Right. So I was hoping someone would ask that question. So let's look at a case where that happens, and this actually lets me answer two questions at once, including one you didn't ask. So if we go to something, let's see, which is the one, this guy. So first of all, we can look at this and we can see a bunch of fairly complicated code right here to set up the exemplar, and I can explain what it does, but the main point is that this is an exemplar where there are multiple objects that have to be created, and perhaps there's even a graph, so you can't write it as an expression because it's not a tree. You have to actually store something in a variable and then share it or something. Not in this case, but you do that. So we typically write a closure and invoke it. But as you can see, this is actually showing me dead code. It's not working. And so first of all, that's what we do when the exemplar fails for some reason. We revert to just a classic class view. And the question is, why isn't it working? And so we'll just copy it into a workspace and evaluate it. And that way I can debug it. In this case, I don't need to debug it because it just tells me here something's missing. Newspeak predictive parsing, which is basically a class used in the exemplar, but it isn't. It'll turn out that it's not loaded in the IDE. So we'll load it. And it's this guy, I think. Yep, that guy. And let's see, is it here? Yeah, now it's here. And now we'll go back to this guy. And you see we do have an instance now. So and now to answer your question, right, this is what you do. And so I've done this. There are a fair amount of classes where this happens. Not too many where it's this elaborate, but you do have these, and this is, you can write fairly elaborate code here and put it in the exemplar. In terms of the other question is sort of the overall burden of dealing with this, right? Because, and what I found is, unfortunately, I have the whole IDE here written, and I've sort of had to add this retroactively, and I'm not done yet. And that is burdensome. I think if you're doing this as you write the code, also goes with your tests and stuff, it's not so bad. In terms of the burden, one more thing I'll say is that there are a lot of situations which are easy to automate. So if the method doesn't take arguments, we don't need to specify an exemplar. There are a bunch of common idioms, at least in this language, say how you specify tests, how you specify applications, a few other things. And for those, we can actually probably find cases where, yeah, like this guy, right? So we have obviously an object inspector. It's a top level class, so but it does have its slots and stuff. But if we look, it doesn't have an exemplar. So you don't need to specify it if we're clever enough to figure it out. And I'm only clever enough to figure it out in the easy cases. But there are a fair amount of those. So especially for classes, a large proportion, probably a majority of the classes automatically can get this. For methods, it's harder, right? If they take arguments, somebody has to tell us what the arguments are. So there is a burden there.
Okay. I see one hand, but we're at time, so I want to wrap things up and let us go on our break.